The slap echoed louder than the espresso machine. Cups rattled. Chairs scraped. Conversations died mid-sentence. In the middle of a quiet cafe, a police officer stood over a man who hadn't raised his voice once. "You think you're funny?" The officer snapped. The man didn't react, didn't argue, didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his coffee cup, calm and unbothered. What the officer didn't know, what no one in that cafe realized yet, was that the quiet man sitting alone in a hoodie and baseball cap was Dwayne Johnson. It had started small. The officer had walked in mid-morning, scanning the room with the casual authority of someone used to attention. The cafe was peaceful. Students typing, couples whispering, a barista humming behind the counter. Dwayne sat near the window, reading on his tablet, dressed low-key. No bodyguards, no spotlight, just a man enjoying a quiet morning. The officer's eyes locked onto him. "Hey, you can't sit there." Dwayne looked up slowly, calmly. "There's no reserved sign," he replied politely. The officer stepped closer. "Move." Still calm. "I'm almost done with my coffee." That was it. That was the trigger. The officer interpreted calm as defiance. Volume replaced reason. "You think you're special?" he barked. The cafe grew tense. Phones subtly lifted. Someone whispered, "This is unnecessary." But the officer doubled down. He demanded ID. Dwayne reached slowly into his jacket. No sudden movements, just composure. The officer snatched the wallet, barely glancing before tossing it back onto the table. "You people always think you can talk back." That line landed heavy. The room felt it. Dwayne's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. The barista stepped forward nervously. "Officer, he hasn't done anything. Stay out of it." The officer's hand slammed onto the table, knocking over Dwayne's coffee. Silence. Complete silence. Liquid dripped slowly off the edge of the table. And that's when it shifted. Not because Dwayne stood up, not because he yelled, but because he remained seated. Steady. Controlled. "Are you done?" Dwayne asked quietly. The officer laughed mockingly. Or what? The tension could have exploded right there. But instead, something unexpected happened. A phone screen in the back of the cafe lit up. Someone had zoomed in. Whispers started spreading like electricity. "That's him." "No way." "Is that?" The cap, the jawline, the build, the unmistakable presence. One teenager near the counter said it first. "That's The Rock." Heads turned again. The officer scoffed. "Yeah, sure it is." But then Dwayne slowly removed his cap. No dramatic motion. No announcement. Just clarity. The room collectively inhaled. Because there he was. Not a character. Not a persona. But undeniably Dwayne Johnson. The officer froze. His posture shifted almost instantly. Confidence drained. Recognition dawning in real time. You should have said something." Dwayne stood now, not aggressively, but fully. And when he stood, the room felt smaller. "I did," he replied calmly. "You just weren't listening." Cameras were already rolling. Multiple angles. The entire exchange captured. The slap. The disrespect. The words. All of it. And the officer knew it. His eyes darted around the cafe. The authority he walked in with had dissolved into uncertainty. Dwayne didn't threaten, didn't raise his voice, didn't demand apology. He simply picked up his wallet, wiped the spilled coffee from the table with a napkin, and said quietly, "You don't treat people differently because of who they are. You treat them right because they're people." The line cut deeper than any confrontation could have. The officer swallowed. No response, because there wasn't one. By the time Dwayne walked toward the exit, the cafe wasn't tense anymore. It was reflective. The barista nodded respectfully. Customers stepped aside, not because of fame, because of composure. Outside, sunlight hit the pavement as he stepped onto the street. Behind him, the officer remained standing, unsure how to recover from a moment that had already escaped his control. Within hours, the footage went viral. Headlines appeared. "Officer confronts quiet man, doesn't recognize Dwayne Johnson." Cafe incident sparks debate. But the real conversation wasn't about celebrity. It was about character. Because Dwayne hadn't used status as leverage. He hadn't weaponized recognition. He let the moment expose itself. Interviews poured in. Dwayne declined most of them. When he finally addressed it briefly, he said, "This isn't about me. It's about how we treat each other when we think nobody important is watching." That line traveled even further than the video. The officer was placed under review. The department issued a statement. But the biggest impact wasn't disciplinary. It was cultural. The clip became a reminder. Power doesn't prove itself through volume. Respect isn't selective. And humility reveals more than intimidation ever could. Weeks later, the cafe owner framed a screenshot from the security footage. Not the slap, not the confrontation, but the moment Dwayne calmly wiped the spilled coffee. Because that was the real story. Control, restraint, strength without spectacle. That was the phrase people kept repeating online. Not because it sounded good, but because it captured exactly what happened in that cafe. The video continued to circulate, not as a scandal clip, but as a lesson. Frame by frame, people analyzed it. The officer's tone, the slap, the spilled coffee, the moment of recognition. The line, "You treat people right because they're people." That was the part that stuck. Not the humiliation, the restraint. In the days that followed, the cafe saw more customers than ever before. Not to gossip, not to point fingers, but to stand where it happened, to sit at that same window seat, to see the space where composure defeated aggression. The owner didn't capitalize with merchandise. He didn't turn it into a marketing stunt. He simply added a small sign near the counter that read, "Respect is non-negotiable." Nothing flashy, just truth. Meanwhile, the officer faced internal review, not just for misconduct, but for judgment, because authority without awareness becomes liability. His colleagues watched the footage too. Some shook their heads. Others said nothing. But the message was clear. You don't get to decide someone's worth based on appearance, tone, or silence. Dwayne never posted the video. He never shared it on his platforms. In fact, when reporters tried to provoke stronger commentary, he declined. "It's bigger than one interaction," he said briefly at an unrelated press event. "Everyone deserves dignity." Then he moved on. No drama. No extended narrative. Because real strength doesn't replay itself for applause. But the public kept talking. Schools discussed it in classrooms during conversations about authority and respect. Leadership podcasts referenced it. Even some law enforcement training programs used the clip, not to shame, but to illustrate escalation versus de-escalation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The quiet man had taught the loud room a lesson. Weeks later, the officer walked into that same cafe again. Not in uniform. Plain clothes. No badge on display. The room recognized him immediately. The air tightened for a split second. He approached the same table, paused, then turned to the counter and ordered coffee quietly. No authority. No commands. Just a customer. Growth doesn't always come with speeches. Sometimes it shows up in posture. The barista placed the cup gently in front of him. "Have a good day," she said evenly. He nodded. "Thank you." Two simple words. But different this time. Because humility sounds different when it's learned. Elsewhere, Dwayne visited a youth mentorship program weeks later. No mention of the cafe incident in the official announcement. But during a Q&A, a teenager asked directly, "Why didn't you react when he disrespected you?" Dwayne leaned back slightly before answering. "Because reacting gives someone else control," he said calmly. "Responding keeps it with you." The room went quiet. That distinction landed heavy. Reaction is impulse. Response is discipline. The cafe footage slowly faded from trending pages, as all viral moments eventually do. But the impact didn't fade with it. Because it wasn't about fame. It wasn't about embarrassment. It wasn't about catching someone in the wrong. It was about revealing something bigger. The difference between authority and leadership. The difference between intimidation and influence. The difference between strength and spectacle. Months later, someone reposted the clip with a simple caption. "The loudest person in the room isn't always the strongest." Millions agreed, because they had seen it play out in real time. They had watched aggression lose its footing. They had watched composure take the room back without raising its voice. It stands, unmoved, unaffected by the volume around it. The weeks turned into months, and the moment slowly transformed from viral clip to quiet legend. Not because people kept replaying the slap, but because they kept replaying the calm. In leadership seminars, speakers referenced the incident without even needing to say his name. "You remember that cafe video?" They'd begin. Heads would nod. Not because of celebrity recognition, but because everyone remembered how it felt. The tension, the imbalance, the shift, and most importantly, the stillness that won. A documentary filmmaker eventually approached Dwayne for permission to include the footage in a broader project about public behavior and influence. He hesitated at first. Not out of fear, but because he didn't want it framed as triumph. It wasn't about winning, he clarified in a quiet conversation. It was about not losing yourself. That line didn't trend, but it lingered. Meanwhile, the officers' department quietly implemented new de-escalation workshops. They didn't reference the cafe directly in official statements, but internally, everyone knew what sparked the urgency. Training shifted, tone awareness, body language reading, bias reflection exercises, small adjustments, but meaningful ones. Sometimes progress doesn't arrive in headlines. It arrives in correction. One afternoon, months later, Dwayne walked into a completely different cafe in another city. No cameras, no tension, just background music and quiet conversation. A young employee recognized him immediately. Eyes widened. "Sir, I just wanted to say, I saw that video. The way you handled it, that changed how I deal with angry customers." Dwayne paused. That mattered more than numbers or views. Because influence measured in millions is powerful. But influence measured in behavior? That's impact. The young employee continued nervously. "I used to argue back when someone disrespected me. Now I just stay steady." Dwayne nodded once. Steady wins more than shouting ever will. Simple, direct, true. Across social platforms, the cafe incident occasionally resurfaced during discussions about public conduct. But the tone had shifted over time. It wasn't outrage anymore. It was reflection. Clips were captioned differently now. "Watch his posture. Notice his breathing. Look at the moment he refuses escalation." The audience had matured with the moment. They weren't watching for drama. They were studying discipline. Years later, during an interview about pressure and public scrutiny, Dwayne was asked a broad question. What defines real strength? He didn't mention the cafe. He didn't mention the officer. He simply said, "Strength is knowing you don't have to prove it." The host leaned back, absorbing that. Because in a world obsessed with proving, flexing, reacting, restraint feels revolutionary. Somewhere else, that former officer eventually retired. Not disgraced, not spotlighted, just changed. People who knew him said he became quieter in his final years on the force, more observant, less reactive. No one knows if the cafe incident was the turning point. But growth rarely announces itself loudly. It shows up in patterns. The cafe owner eventually replaced the small, "respect is non-negotiable" sign with a new one. It read, "Character is revealed in pressure." Customers asked about it sometimes. He'd just smile and say, "Something we learned here once," and leave it at that. Moments like that cafe encounter don't live forever in headlines. They don't stay trending. They don't dominate cycles. But they echo. In posture, in tone, in choices made during future confrontations. And every time someone chooses calm over chaos, every time someone absorbs tension without returning it, every time someone holds ground without raising a voice, the lesson continues. Not loudly, but firmly. Because presence doesn't require noise. And dignity doesn't demand defense. It simply remains.